I think right now in the United States, conspiracy thinking is so integral to the Trump regime because it's a way that we engage in this collaborative storytelling about this ghostly enemy within.
Annalee Newitz is the author of the book Stories Are Weapons: Psychological Warfare in the American Mind, which traces through history the way disinformation, propaganda, and violent threats have evolved from military weapons deployed against foreign adversaries into tools of domestic culture war. In addition to their nonfiction work, Annalee is also a sci-fi writer and author of the USA Today bestseller Automatic Noodle, as well as a contributor to the independent daily newsletter Flaming Hydra. For this episode, Annalee gives us a primer on the ways that psyops and psychological warfare have long propped up the American colonial project, including the many men who have been masters of its weaponized storytelling. Just a note, we recorded this episode shortly after the brutal murder of Renee Nicole Good by ICE agent Jonathan Ross, and now it's coming out shortly after the brutal murder of Alex Preddy by an as-yet unnamed ICE agent. As we watch in real time the utterly baffling, sinister, psychopathic psychological warfare being waged by the DHS and the administration at large in regards to these murders, I hope this conversation can help put what we're living through right now into historical context and remind us that in addition to fighting against the world we do not want, we also need to hold inside ourselves the world that we envision, the one we are fighting for. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am so excited to welcome my new friend, Annalee, to the show. And we are going to talk today about some very kind of expansive history of things like propaganda, of psyops, of psy wars, culture wars. And we're going to really try to dig into some of the roots, particularly the American roots of this phenomenon. So welcome, Annalee. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about all this dark history.
Yeah, that's what we do here. So I just wanted to start with a quote from your book to kind of situate us in your work. It feels like very pertinent right now and pertinent to our entire history here. You write, "In the United States, we treat fiction as politics and vice versa. As a result, it's difficult for us to build a sphere where we can come to a consensus about what's true rather than which story we like best." If that doesn't explain where we're at right now, nothing does. So I was hoping that you could let us know a little bit about why you chose to write about this topic. Obviously, it makes sense based on where we are, and it makes sense because it's kind of the same thing we try to do on American Hysteria, just different format, different types of stories. But I was hoping you could tell us if there was like a breakthrough moment for you where you were like, this is it. I have to do this work. I have to put this much time into such a expansive book.
Yeah. So there's actually a somewhat boring publishing history behind this book that I won't go into, but it did go through many different iterations. And, at the time that I started working on it, which was shortly before the pandemic, so in 2019, I had been writing about history and technology for a really long time. And one of the things that I had become really interested in was this is when Twitter was still a going concern. And we'd had several waves of what experts call coordinated inauthentic activity on Twitter, where a group of operatives maybe from the States, maybe from Russia, maybe from other places, working with bots, were kind of just propagating misinformation. And some of the misinformation campaigns were just fascinating to me because they kind of unfolded like a story. And you'd sort of get a wave of disinformation and then a new wave that would build on that one.
Yeah.
And I'd written a column for New Scientist about the misinformation around what was called the DC blackout. And operatives were claiming that during the protests around George Floyd, that they, and the Black Lives Matter protests, that DC had blacked out the city, which was hilarious because people would be like, I am reporting from on the ground DC. Where everything is blacked out. But it became this huge meme on Twitter. And the operatives who did this, I never figured out who was behind it. I kept kind of putting out feelers and being like, hey guys, this was an awesome operation. I'd love to talk to you about how you did it. No, for some reason, like, whoever Estonians, Russians didn't want to talk to me about it. But they did this great thing where they were like, Washington is blacked out. And then 3 hours later, they were like, that's misinformation. There's bad guys who want you to think that Washington is blacked out. And I was like, oh, two-part. Like, it's like it really did feel like it was like they were writing an epic thriller. Yeah. So I got really interested in like the narrative structure of misinformation to start with. And then, a lot of my background in terms of my recent work is in archaeology and history. And so as we started to be more immersed in misinformation campaigns online and in politics, I really wanted to think about it kind of archaeologically. Like, okay, where did this come from? Like here in the United States, why do we do this? How long have we been doing this? Like, how do we fuck with each other? Oh, is it okay for me to say? Yeah. Okay. Like, because every nation has its own ways of messing with its citizens. Yeah. And the US has its own special flavor. And so that was really the germ of this book was how do we go back to the origins of this country and think about the foundational lies that it's built on and the foundational principles of manipulating each other, which again, all nations do this. But I wanted to see what it is in the United States that we've done to each other over time. And the more I researched, the more I saw just these incredible patterns emerging. Yeah. And so that was the book. And it wound up taking much longer than I thought.
Well, yeah, everything does, doesn't it?
It was supposed to be like a quick polemic. And then I was like, oh, actually, this is going to be 4 years of research. Sorry.
Yeah, I can relate to that on a smaller scale for sure. So before we get into some more of the content of your book, I always think it's helpful to define some terms, which you do. So in this book, we're talking about psyops, we're talking about psy wars, we're talking about culture wars. Could you just briefly explain to us what those mean to you in the context of your book?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it was one of the things that I was most interested in answering because actually there is a pretty concrete definition of psychological operation or psyop. And it comes out of the US military. This whole book is about the United States. So all of the terms I'm using are going to be US Army, US military. I mostly looked at the Army. And in the early 20th century, after World War I, we started to see the Army codifying the activities that they eventually called psychological operations. And basically, it means any message, so it can be text, video, whatever, any message sent by a state power with the intent of undermining the morale of an enemy or inspiring the enemy to surrender. So this idea, of course, goes very, very, very far back in military strategy thinking. Sun Tzu talks about it in The Art of War, which is, thousands of years ago that he was first thinking about that. And one of the things that's important to remember is that psychological operations are intended to prevent kinetic war. They're intended to make the enemy surrender before any military force is needed. They're intended to stop wars, to end wars without further bloodshed. At the same time, psychological operations are not like information that you get from the government, from, the executive branch. Like if you're engaged in a psychological operation, you are allowed to lie. You are allowed to exaggerate. You're allowed to issue violent threats. And the idea is like, if we can manipulate the enemy or threaten the enemy enough, we won't have to blow them up because the goal is don't kill anyone, just bully them, as it were. For a lot of thinkers in the 20th century, having been through World War I and then later World War II, that was a kind of a utopian goal. They were like, hey, if we can just be messing with each other's minds instead of like another atomic bomb, like that's like a huge win for us. And so a lot of the thinkers who I talk about in this book are really interested in that idea. And then the second thing I want to say, so we've talked about formal psychological operations, which are done by a state power deliberately, right? Like people sit down and they're like, I am going to lie and manipulate in order to win this war. So then there's culture war. And after World War II, in the United States, when we enter into this Cold War phase and the US government starts prosecuting and persecuting Americans, queer Americans, communist Americans, immigrants, all different groups that are marginalized, suddenly you start to see all of the strategies of psychological war being used domestically.
Right.
And so there's this kind of weapons transfer program that happens during the Cold War, and we're still in that phase. So now we've moved from psychological operations only being used formally against enemies of the nation to being used stochastically and informally against American citizens or people who live in the United States. And so Americans use it against each other. The thing that's tricky about culture war is that you can be engaged in it without deliberately intending to.
Right,
You're never going to do a psyop without all kinds of preparation and filing forms and like, I mean, I talked to people in the army who were like, we have to fill out so many forms to like
to do a psyop.
to like do a psyop that it's like it takes a year to do a YouTube video or whatever. But if you're just doing culture war, you know, just sharing a piece of propaganda on Facebook, you can be a culture warrior by doing that. And you may not even realize that you're doing it. You might just be like, oh, this is a cool story about how trans people should die.
Yeah, right.
And of course, that is part of the culture war, but like you're not personally kind of getting paid by the government to do it. You're just doing it for fun, which is in some ways a dark outcome.
It sure is. Yeah. No, that was a fantastic explanation. Thank you so much for that. So let's maybe start with, maybe we could call him an early culture warrior. We can definitely call him someone who participated in a lot of fakery. And that is I like to call him the Forrest Gump of the 1700s because he's everywhere. And that is Benjamin Franklin. We've talked about on our show some of his like satires and his hoaxes that he did more on a personal level. Like he convinced some of the public that his competitor in his almanacs was dead through astrology, which he hated. So he made up a fake astrologer. You know, he does all kinds of wacky stuff. But on the far less amusing side, he was also engaged in a lot of propaganda, especially during what are known as the Indian Wars. So can we start with looking at Ben Franklin in that context and what he did as that kind of early version of an operative?
Yeah, I mean, and he's an interesting case because he's kind of engaging in psychological war and kind of culture war. He was really especially active during the Revolutionary War.
Right.
And so he was interested in convincing the British public that they should stop fighting the war, right? Classic psyop kind of goal. You want the enemy to stop fighting. So he creates a fake newspaper full of fake information about skirmishes in the Revolutionary War that involve local indigenous nations, some of whom had allied with the British and some of whom had allied with the States and some who later allied with the French. And it's very complicated. But what he ends up doing in this story is claiming, because again, he's trying to speak to the British public. So he invents a story about how the Senecas, who are fighting with the British, are scalping American settlers.
Right.
And totally made up. But, you know, he should have been a horror writer. Like he does this incredible like body horror description of all these scalps and how they're being sent back to England and how this is all on behalf of the crown. And he's trying to tell the British public, hey, your soldiers are engaging in war crimes and they're acting just like indigenous people. So he's doing a double duty here. He's trying to make the British look bad, but he's also helping to create this myth of the bloodthirsty indigenous nations, right?
Yeah.
And it's a hinge point because, as you mentioned, the Indian Wars, because this is a moment when the Revolutionary War is fading out. The United States is going to win, but the United States is right about to engage in about 100 years of war against a ton of different indigenous nations. And so he's doing psyops on behalf of the United States government against the British and against the Senecas and against a bunch of future nations that are going to be crushed under the boot of the US military. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is a really interesting example of early culture war and psychological war in the United States. And I think it's interesting that it starts with literal fake news.
Yeah.
And this idea of fake news has been with us since the inception of the nation. And it begins with representatives of the US government creating fake news, or citizens like Ben Franklin doing it on behalf of the US government. And we see this continue throughout the Indian Wars in the 19th century and then all the way up into the present day.
Yeah, I'd say like very much into the present day with, podcasters and streamers. And I mean, it seems like you could just pop this into a modern context and it's virtually the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. More after this. And now back to the show. Can you talk about kind of some of the ways that Indigenous people were propagandized against, kind of like this last Indian idea I found really interesting when you wrote about it, and how that continued to affect some of these Indian wars?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the Indian Wars are a series of battles and wars against, hundreds of indigenous nations. So it takes place over a very long period of time.
Right.
And it's a war that is being waged on many fronts, partly through kinetic force. So using, guns and military incursions and massacres, but also it is a war of politics and ideology. And that's where it gets very interesting, because one of the first things that the U.S. government does shortly after the 1830s era of the Trail of Tears and these massive relocations of many tribes to the area that's now Oklahoma, they start setting up residential schools for indigenous kids and removing those kids often forcibly from their families. Not always. Sometimes their families were like, sure, go ahead. But mostly it was by force. And they would take children, put them into these schools under the auspices of improving them, right? Of educating them, teaching them how to be good Americans, teaching them English, teaching them Western forms of agriculture, which look very, very different from indigenous agriculture, and in fact are not particularly well suited for the Americas. But that's another, that's a whole other issue. And they also teach them Christianity. And what this ends up doing is creating effectively a multi-decade long brainwashing program. And indigenous scholars today will use that phrase. They'll say like, yeah, this is kind of the original US brainwashing operation where children are forcibly made to participate in a culture that isn't theirs. A lot of times these kids would be young enough that they would not even have fully learned their own language before they were forced to learn English. And so it's a way of destroying indigenous culture by making the new generation simply not know it, simply be unable to speak to their elders, which is this really shocking and traumatizing loss. So that's the psychological battle right there. Like that is the essence of psychological war, when the US government, aided by the US military, is forcibly re-educating an entire generation of children who are basically the children of a military adversary. These are people who are the kids of our adversaries on the battlefield. So that's happening. So at the same time, this is where it gets really interesting to me, is that it's not like all white settlers are down with this program. A lot of white settlers are seeing what's happening. They're seeing their neighbors who are being slaughtered. They're seeing these kids taken away in tears. And, these schools were brutal. Like children were killed. They were beaten. They were raped. It was not cool. And for many liberal white people, particularly on the East Coast, they were questioning this, and they were questioning their representatives. They were questioning the government. They were writing treatises about how this was inhumane. So the US government has to come up with new ways of justifying what they're doing. So one way they're justifying it is this fake idea that like they're uplifting Indigenous people by educating them, and they're building new schools that are nicer and that kind of thing. The other way is much more in the realm of culture war, and that is to convince white settlers that there's a kind of scientific inevitability to the replacement of Indigenous people with white settlers. And most people have encountered this idea in the idea of the frontier, that the frontier is this like wide open place that is empty and like just waiting for white people to come and settle it. That whole idea of the frontier was absolutely manufactured by the government to get white settlers down with this program, and claiming that it was empty, even though they were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight wars against the people who lived there. That's quite a mindfuck, as we would say now. Like, it's hard to hold both those thoughts in your head at the same time, but that's what psychological war and culture war are there for. They're there for making people hold contradictory views that the frontier is open. It's open to all of us. It's just an empty, wild place, and it's full of terrible enemies who we must crush. And we must spend money to crush them. And, you know, the idea of manifest destiny is also part of that. It became a meme, you know, in the 19th century version of a meme. And then the idea of the frontier was also a meme. And there's a famous historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, who presented this essay at the World's Fair in the 1890s called The Frontier Thesis, where he describes how the making of America, and remember, again, this essay became incredibly famous. It was like the tipping point of its day. Like, it was huge. He says, the way that America works is that it's a nation that's built on white settlers absorbing the culture of Indigenous people as those Indigenous people naturally die out. So again, there's this kind of weird, almost like Darwinian inevitability, like, oh, it's not that we're murdering them and forcibly re-educating their children. It's that they're just naturally dying out, and then white people naturally come in. And if you're familiar with the white supremacist idea of the replacement theory, this is the original replacement theory. And the theory is that white people replace Indigenous people, and that's what makes the United States what it is.
Right.
Frederick Jackson Turner argues the character of America is so great because all of these white settlers have absorbed all the best things about these Indigenous nations. And, you know, as they gently go into the sunset.
Right.
So it's a really pervasive myth. It continued all the way up through the 20th century. I mean, people still believe that. They'll say like, oh, it was just natural. You know, there weren't very many Indigenous people anyway. And then forgetting about all of these massive protest movements that came along, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, like the ghost dance movement.
Yeah, I would love if you would talk about the ghost dance movement too.
The ghost dance movement is really, in some sense, the original US-based protest movement, and it involves dance and song as well as political meaning. And it would have been very hard for white settlers in these places on the so-called frontier to avoid seeing not only that it wasn't a natural process, that it was a brutal militaristic process, but that also Indigenous nations were protesting and were pushing back. And sometimes they pushed back in the courts. Sometimes they pushed back with these direct actions around ghost dances where they would just simply pray and dance for days. And the point of the ghost dance really was to bring into being a post-colonial world. Like, it was, the ghost dance is all about like what happens after the white settlers are gone and everything's good again.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a science fictional sort of protest where it's like, actually, don't worry. Eventually, the buffalo will come back and these white settlers will go back to wherever they came from.
Right.
So I think the most important thing to think about in the context of the Indian Wars is that it wasn't just about the US government destroying indigenous nations. It was also a moment of the birth of American protest movements, and indigenous nations kind of invented these forms of protest to push back and maintain their culture. And that's why we still have so many indigenous nations today. It's because their ancestors were like, yeah, we're going to stand our ground. And even if we get shot and slaughtered, we're going to keep dancing. We're going to keep asserting our sovereignty. And it took generations, but that sovereignty exists. And it's, I hope, expanding with land back movements as well.
Yeah, that section of your book about the ghost dances was really powerful and not something I knew a ton about. You also referred to it, I believe, as like one of the earliest forms of moral panic, as in the reaction to that. We talk about moral panics a lot on our shows. I think that they are just one arm of the psyop in a way, maybe less intentional. Well, you know, it's a mixed bag.
It's culture war.
Yeah, it's culture war. So I was wondering if you could also talk about how the powers that be reacted and tried to kind of cut out the power of the ghost dance.
Yeah, so one of the things that was interesting as I was researching the ghost dance was I was, of course, looking for indigenous histories, and there's a lot of really great writing about the ghost dance from the indigenous perspective now. But there's also newspapers from the 19th century written by white settlers about the ghost dance. And you can see that these articles, like I was looking at pieces like some from the New York Times and then some from other local papers in the West, where they would, of course, refer to the ghost dance as a war dance, which it absolutely was not. And in fact, the whole idea of a war dance is kind of made up. And it would be used as a justification for a military crackdown. So if a nation or a tribe was having a ghost dance, as they often were, say, in Standing Rock, which has long been a location of indigenous resistance, then the military could come in. They'd be like, oh, they're having a war dance. They're preparing to attack. Yeah. They're preparing to do some kind of terrorist action, essentially. And that was, again, it's very similar to rhetoric that we're seeing now about protests, about just the act of protesting is enough to justify violent retribution. And I mean, Wounded Knee is a terrific example. I mean, a horrible example of how that unfolds historically, where, you know, Sitting Bull was leading ghost dances. And you can actually see video of ghost dances. There were some movies taken of it at the turn of the century, and it's a dance. Right. It is not at all violent. It is people dancing in a circle, singing. There's different variations of it depending on the nation, but it's very clearly peaceful. Yeah. And it is not aimed at anything other than really morale building and community building. But the moral panic that is spread through these articles in these newspapers is, oh, your neighbors over there on the reservation are like preparing to go to war. That's like when they dance, that means they're going to attack your homestead any minute now. And so we see this pattern that keeps getting repeated where there's a government crackdown, there's protest, and the protest becomes an excuse for further crackdowns, aided by this moral panic. And of course, in the 19th century, the Indian Wars, the moral panic was so deep and multi-layered. Like there was the panic over these protests. There was the panic over the fact that indigenous nations offered an alternative to Christianity and offered an alternative to Western forms of government. And in the 19th century, that was incredibly threatening because this is at a moment when the United States borders are still in flux. The idea of what the United States is going to be has been destabilized and is not yet really set in any kind of real way. And people are scared. You know, white settlers want very badly to feel like this is a white Christian nation. And yet there are all these people around them, all these nations saying like, actually, well, we do it our way and we don't need Christianity and we don't need your system of farming. We have our own way that has thousands of years of history behind it, by the way. And that's very terrifying. And so the moral panic is, kind of existential.
Yeah, it's what they call the woke mind virus of the 19th century, I guess.
Pretty much. Yes, the ghost dance was one of the first woke mind viruses. Yeah. And it did spread, right? It spread from place to place. And so you can see how the U.S. government would be just terrified.
Right, which I love.
Oh, yeah, we love to see it.
We love to see it. More after this. And now, back to the show. Okay, so moving forward in time to kind of a really different moment in our history, the 1920s, we meet advertising guru Edward Bernays, a super interesting person who we have talked about a little bit. We talked about it for anyone who wants to learn more on our influencers episode. And he was a man who really kind of brought modern advertising into the public sphere. Like, he's an architect of advertising, as well as someone who really understood the power of propaganda. So could you talk about what his role was in our culture and how propaganda played into his ideas?
Yeah, so he really is an interesting and pivotal figure. And one of the things that he understood, first of all, his uncle was Sigmund Freud.
Yes.
So he had been around people who were really immersed in this new field of psychoanalysis, this field that focused on the ways in which our minds play tricks on us, the ways in which we can be tricked and traumatized, and all the different ways that we can be manipulated psychologically without guns, right? Just using the power of the word. But Bernays also understood the power of the press. And you said, this is a very different time, but it's important to remember that the 1920s, like, the Indian Wars would have still been fresh in many, many people's minds.
That's true.
Some of them were still kind of ongoing, and there was still a lot of destruction of tribes. And so he knew how newspapers had been used to propagate anti-Indigenous sentiment. And he would have been paying attention to that, as well as paying attention to all these new ideas about how to use stories to manipulate people. As you said, he really jumpstarts the professional field of advertising and public relations. He really thought of himself as a public relations man, someone who could use storytelling and images and media to get the public to change its mind. So not just an individual, but like vast groups of Americans, which became possible because mass media meant that you really could get the same article in front of like potentially millions of people. So It's not that rinky-dink stuff that Ben Franklin was doing with his newspaper. Like, this was really high level shit. And so he gets his start doing advertising for cigarettes. And he has this great idea in the 1920s that, cigarettes, there's so many of them. We need more people to be smoking. And the cigarette companies are concerned about this. And the problem is that it's considered impolite for women to smoke, particularly in public. And so he's like, great, why don't we try to connect smoking with freedom, because this is the era of the suffragette. And all of the hip young women in New York City, which is kind of where he was basing his target audience, was people in New York City. And he's like, look, this is how we're going to do this manipulation. And he's very conscious about it. He's like, we are going to imply to women that part of this political freedom of suffrage also means that you can smoke in the street. Yeah. And so he reaches out to a bunch of debutantes who are kind of the influencers of their day. And he's like, hey, why don't you join this freedom parade and all smoke? And that can be kind of this like new sign of freedom. And also we'll get a bunch of magazines to cover it, right? Because he's always about like, get the story in the media, get it in the newspaper, get it in the magazine. And so it's a roaring success because everybody wants to write about what the debutantes are doing. They're out there smoking. The cigarette company is excited. And it does, in fact, popularize the idea that it's okay for women to smoke in public. So he has this great success. And there's three parts of it, right? He's manipulating the media. He's manipulating people's desire for a commodity, but he's also doing that by manipulating them politically, right? So he's always connecting politics with kind of consumer desires and advertising. And the thing that's super interesting is then he goes on in his career to work with the CIA and to do, explicitly political work. He goes on in the 1950s to work with the CIA, who want to unseat Arbenz, who's the democratically elected president of Guatemala, but who isn't allowing Americans to own plantations in Guatemala anymore. So the CIA brings him in and they're like, how can we plant stories in the newspaper that make people think that Arbenz is a communist and therefore should be deposed? So he does it. And now there's all of the papers related to this have been declassified. So now it used to be kind of rumored that he'd been working on this campaign, but now it is confirmed that he was indeed working on behalf of the CIA and United Fruit, which became Chiquita Bananas, because United Fruit owned a bunch of plantations in Guatemala that when Arbenz was elected, he gave back to the people. He was like, no, we're not going to let America own half of Guatemala to grow bananas. We have people here who are starving, who want to have their own farms. But because Bernays was so skilled at getting propaganda stories into the paper, he started spreading these rumors that Arbenz was working with the Soviets and was a communist and needed to be deposed. And he really helped the CIA out with that operation. He really paved the way to making Americans think it was A-okay to get rid of this democratically elected leader for the crime of not allowing America to grow bananas in Guatemala. So he had this incredible impact on how we understand both advertising and psychological warfare. And today, if you are being trained as someone who does PSYOPs at Fort Bragg, for example, which is where the Army trains PSYOP operatives, you will be taught to treat every PSYOP like an advertising campaign. Mm-hmm. And for this book, I did a kind of crash course with a guy who used to teach at Fort Bragg, who taught PSYOPs there. And he gave me a declassified textbook. And it's all about finding a target market, finding a target audience. They do focus groups with people, trying to figure out to workshop their PSYOPs and make sure they'll be appealing. And so there's almost no line at all at this point between the techniques of advertising and the techniques of psychological war, which is really, really weird and also very American.
I was just about to say that is one of the most deeply American things that I've ever heard is that marriage between those two.
Yeah.
So moving on from Ed Bernays, another person that you talk about a lot in your book who feels very important to this story is Paul Linebarger, and he is a science fiction writer, which is very important, as well as the author of a book that came out in 1948 called Psychological Warfare, which I know is a pretty foundational text. So he wrote sci-fi books as, I wrote it down, Cordwainer Smith, which is quite a moniker. So how do you think his understanding of fiction, his understanding of what it means to be a writer, helped his understanding of the power of propaganda?
I think much like Bernays having this insight that psychological war needs to learn from advertising, Linebarger had that insight about learning from fiction. Mm-hmm. And as you said, he wrote science fiction under the name Cordwainer Smith. He also wrote psychological novels under a different name. He wrote spy thrillers under a different name. He had a lot of names.
Creative guy.
And yeah, he was a sneaky guy. And most importantly, he worked in psychological operations with the Army during World War II. And those experiences informed the creation of this book, Psychological Warfare, which for a very long time was a classified military document. It was something that was circulated within Army PSYOP circles, but not available to the public. And the 1948 version of the book is very, very interesting. He issued another version that was kind of the Cold War revision, which I would not recommend. And he really lays out the ways that a psychological warfare campaign, like the ones that he worked on in Asia, has to be a story. There has to be a sense that your audience for this psyop is going to buy into it because it's a compelling narrative. So he really encouraged his students, because he taught psyops as well, he encouraged them to do things like learn from Laurel and Hardy. And he has this great line that I quote in my book where he says, you know, people are going to be more persuaded by a Laurel and Hardy movie than they are by a documentary full of like square-jawed farmers, you know, which is kind of the classic image of how propaganda works. It's like a bunch of, you know, very stern-looking men being patriotic. And he's like, no, if you want people to love America, if you want them to surrender to America and think that America deserves to win, then you need to convince them that America is fun and awesome. And you do that by telling stories and by showing that, you know, America is this place where we have funny comedies and we like have this abundance of freedom where we can, you know, just go to the movies. That sounds very nice. But he also was involved in a lot of, you know, black ops where, you know, he was trying to really, you know, undermine the enemy's confidence. And so he was very interested in how to lie to people and how to, you know, engage in subterfuge and also how to deliver the best threats. Because remember, psychological war always has to involve a violent threat of some kind. It doesn't have to, but it generally does. So, you know, you tell a story and there's always an or else kind of at the end of it. But one of the things I thought was so interesting about his approach was that he had a kind of almost like a social media approach to these stories. So he'd say like, okay, say that you want to undermine people's faith in their government. You know, he's thinking about specifically China at one point. He was an expert in China and he had kind of partially grown up there and he spoke Mandarin. And so he was like, all right, what we need to do is tell a story about how the rebellion or the resistance against the government is working. So you want to do something like, okay, is the government preventing people from moving around? Like, is it preventing people from going from place to place, which is obviously a very typical thing that a closed regime does. He's like, if that's the case, you want to flood the country with fake IDs. To give people a sense of how they could move around and to make them think that there's some rebel organization that's pushing back by creating these fake IDs and giving people the ability to move around the way they want. So those fake IDs become the seed of a story that people in that nation tell themselves about how actually, oh, maybe we could overthrow this regime and surrender to the United States. Another operation that he suggests is, oh, is a country dealing with runaway inflation or some kind of economic problem, then flood the country with fake money, with really, really great counterfeit money. And again, giving people the sense that there's some rebellious group among them that's making money and that's going to help them get what they need because they don't have money. Like a lot of his science fiction is also about this same thing. Like a lot of his science fiction is about how rebel movements gain followers and how, because he was mostly working after World War II. So he's in the midst of the Cold War. And so he's very interested in how do you destabilize a communist regime like China or the Soviet Union. And so the way you do that is by seeding all these stories of rebellion and resistance. And so he has a whole cycle of science fiction stories about the resistance to this oppressive group called the Instrumentality, who are this kind of semi-communist Chinese closed regime. They're not identified as Chinese, but their culture strongly resembles communist China. So he's thinking about this in his fiction as well as in his day-to-day work as an operative and as a professor who teaches psyops. And so I think that this is important because, again, when we think about culture war today, a lot of it is about imagining some kind of ghostly enemy or a ghostly kind of rebellion that's out there somewhere.
Yeah.
And whether you're doing it because you want to destabilize a regime, like you want to create the illusion that there's a huge resistance to the presidency, or as we're seeing right now, the opposite, where you have a government that wants to create the illusion that there's some kind of Antifa movement to justify cracking down on innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, it's these competing stories, right? It's all about how do you create a fiction that people can believe in. And then the best part is that they start embellishing on it. They start telling their own stories. They start building.
They make fan fiction.
Yeah, it's meta. It's like it's collaborative fiction. Yeah, and that's where conspiracy thinking comes in, and that's why I think right now in the United States, conspiracy thinking is so integral to the Trump regime, because it's a way that we engage in this collaborative storytelling about this ghostly enemy within, right? How do we justify violence against just a lady in a car? Well, because there's this secret group.
This well-funded, yeah.
Yeah. And so, as soon as we're in that mode of like telling the story ourselves and inventing more fiction to justify what we're doing, we are absolutely, we've been entrapped by the psyop. We've actually we've had a little bit of brainwashing right there. So, I mean, brainwashing doesn't, work perfectly, but
sure. But I think we know what you mean. Yeah.
I always say, like, people often ask me about this and, about like, well, why do people fall for this? And I'm like, because propaganda works. Like, it actually does work, just like advertising works. Doesn't work 100% of the time. But hey, if it only works 60% of the time, you're golden. If it only works 30% of the time, you're golden. Like, you don't need to capture everyone.
Right. And how attractive is it to have a simplified narrative, right? When everything is so complicated. I mean, we talk about this a lot. Like, I think that one of the big attracting forces of conspiracy theory is just that simplification of good and bad, and, taking what could otherwise be a lot of boring reading on statistics and history and turning that into a science fiction book that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that is digestible by the masses who don't want or can't, don't have the time to truly immersively understand a topic. I think it's so ripe for that kind of manipulation. Just pop in a sensational story and let's go.
Yeah. One of Linebarger's great insights in terms of creating propaganda is that every piece of propaganda has to contain a grain of truth.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it doesn't hook you. So that's the frustrating thing for us as we're wading through all of this propaganda that we're dealing with in the United States right now, is that the best propaganda does have some element of people are feeling disenfranchised, people are losing jobs, people are uncomfortable with immigration. And then you build your fictional story around that.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so powerful. So you can never have a pure lie. You just get to have these little nuggets of truth buried in something really pernicious and fake.
Yeah, absolutely. More after this. And now back to the show. Okay, so moving on from our new friend, Paul, let's talk about someone who maybe I would have been friends with in real life, and that's William Marston. I did not know a lot about him. I didn't know he was an early Polly king. That's fun. But maybe you could talk a little bit about, and I know he's not perfect, but maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of his work in the comic realm, and maybe we can follow him through some culture war stuff leading closer to the present day.
Yeah. So William Moulton Marston is famously the creator of Wonder Woman, the character in the comic book in the early 1940s. And he started out as a psychologist. He was a professor. He worked briefly at Harvard. He had quite a pedigree. And his early work was all around lie detectors. He was really interested in figuring out when people were lying and using gadgets and that sort of thing. So that's, I think, why Wonder Woman has this lasso of truth. That's like one of her very first accessories. And which also, of course, allows her to tie people up, which was another thing that Marston was interested in kind of recreationally. So he was a very early male feminist. He really believed in women's power. He was, as you said, polyamorous. He had multiple female partners, all of whom were had careers, and also one of them worked with him on a lot of his psychological research. So he had a lot of respect for women, and he really believed that you could create propaganda that would encourage everyone to be feminists and to respect women. I mean, he's a contemporary of Edward Bernays. Yeah. So they're coming out of the same exact place. They're both interested in psychology. They're both interested in using the media to advance their opinions and to sway the masses. But Bernays goes dark side. Yeah. And Marston goes kind of light side. I mean, he's pretty chaotic, but he does explicitly state that he wants to create Wonder Woman as a form of propaganda on behalf of women's power. And so he creates this incredible character for the organization that later becomes DC Comics. And she's instantly popular. They've never had a female character who was a lead character before. And in the comic books where she's introduced, they sometimes have these polls at the back saying, like, which character do you want to see more of? And Wonder Woman would always win those polls.
Oh, I love that.
And at the end of each Wonder Woman comic, he would have a section that was just an essay about a famous woman in history who'd done something cool. So it was also this educational opportunity. Those little essays kind of stopped appearing in the comic after a certain point, after he was no longer working on it. But that is kind of the origin story. And so if you go back and you look at these early Wonder Woman comics, you know, she is this powerful woman, and also she is anti-war from the beginning. And so part of his goal was also propaganda on behalf of peace, you know, on behalf of ending war. And again, this kind of interestingly fits in with his propaganda agenda, because if you think of psychological warfare as like the origin of American propaganda, like it's all about preventing kinetic war. You know, it's all about like using our brains instead of our guns. Yep. I refer to Wonder Woman in my book as a culture bomb, because she kind of comes around at a time when everyone is terrified of the actual bomb. And she's this force of culture who is pushing back on the idea of making war, on the idea of patriarchy. And of course, Wonder Woman in the 1950s becomes a source of moral panic as well. Yes. And there are a series of congressional hearings about whether, you know, the comic should be censored because it's leading to young women not becoming housewives and not having children, and that it's inspiring young women to think that they should, be lesbians or any number of other unacceptable kinds of social pursuits. Yes. Shall we say?
We'll call it that.
So, I mean, and of course, the moral panic around comic books was much wider than just Wonder Woman, but she was a major locus of this concern. Yeah. Precisely because Wonder Woman was so effective at reminding people that women could be powerful. And that is part of the reason why Ms. Magazine put her on the cover of one of their first magazines. I think the first Ms. Magazine had Wonder Woman on the cover.
Yeah, I think that's true.
I guess it was supposed to be Shirley Chisholm, but they chickened out. So that kind of sucks. But, but Wonder Woman is still this amazing icon for feminism. And I think the thing that's important about that is to remember that, like the Ghost Dance pushed back on white supremacy in the 19th century, you have these cultural icons, these culture bombs that can push back against oppression. even in really dark times.
Totally. Ugh, that's so true. And yeah, I love culture bomb is such a good word, especially in its context of what she was fighting against originally.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this, the moral panic around comics. If we could just get a little bit more into, everyone's favorite guy, Frederick Wertham, author of the 1950s, The Seduction of the Innocent, which, as you've mentioned, brings up the apparent lesbianism of Wonder Woman, among many other things.
Mm-hmm.
Could we talk about that kind of campaign that he created, or at least helped create, around this kind of culture war thing that we see today of like the danger of pieces of art or certain, whether it be video games or books that have queer characters, whatever the moral panic du jour is. It's a similar thing to what Wertham was doing in a pretty concerted effort to blame comic books for a lot of society's ills. So could you just give us a little crash course on old Frederick, and we'll talk a little bit more about him?
Yeah, he's an incredibly important figure in the 1950s. He really does lead this campaign against comics. He was very worried, much as sort of captains of moral panics today. He was very worried about the images that children were exposed to in comics and how it might change their identities. And he was explicitly worried about homosexuality. He was worried that Batman was turning little boys gay, and that Wonder Woman was turning little girls queer or lesbian. But also, in the case of Wonder Woman, she was suggesting that women could have lives outside the domestic sphere, right? So it's gender panic, it's sexual panic, and it's specifically focused on pop culture that's consumed by children. So he publishes this book, The Seduction of the Innocent, which is specifically about comics' effect on kids. And there is this series of hearings, congressional hearings, where he testifies about how he's also a psychologist, and he has a clinic in Harlem, which is such a weird cultural symbol because it was the first clinic in Harlem for dealing with mental illness among the Black population in New York. So in some ways, it was like this really progressive institution. And it did do a lot of good for adults, but it also had this negative impact where he used it as this kind of proving ground for his theories about how comic books were causing young Black kids and young other marginalized groups like poor kids or, Puerto Rican kids. They were being, led into lives of degeneracy by these comics. Instead of like celebrating the fact that the kids are literate and they're learning things and they're like seeking out books, he says, no, it's making them violent. It's making them sexual in the wrong way. So he's, testifying to all this. And I think the thing that's interesting about Wertham is that you have to understand him in the context of this larger movement that was happening in the 1950s around the idea of mental hygiene.
Right.
And this was a huge buzzword. It was something that the US government was really concerned about because so many people returning from World War II were dealing with trauma. And so mental health was actually considered a national issue. And President Truman talked about how we needed to have government money put into supporting, mental health services. And part of that push, that government push, was to produce culture that would lead to mental hygiene, being healthy in your mind. And of course, mental hygiene meant sticking to the proper gender roles, sticking to the proper racial hierarchy, crossing the street when you're supposed to. Like it kind of shades from like good advice, both ways before you go across the street, to really terrible kind of patriarchy stuff. So because of the fact that people were so sensitized in the 1950s to the idea that mental health was really fragile, this moral panic was able to take root really deeply because people were like, well, what is causing our kids to be so upset? And you have a movie like Rebel Without a Cause, which comes out in 1955, which is about that. It's about like, why are the kids so nuts? We don't understand. So there was this sense that we had to do something about it. And I think, again, anyone who has dipped their nose into mass culture right now, is surrounded by these same kinds of messages. Like you have a book like The Anxious Generation, which is a terrible book and is based on, really flawed and misinterpreted research. But it suggests that, the internet is making the kids crazy, basically. And I also think that this is the period of time, the 1950s, where we're worried about mental hygiene, that you start to get what I consider to be the kind of three-pronged attack that you see in every culture war today, which is if you want to demonize your enemy, the enemy within, right? Whether that's little girls reading comics or queer people in the government, you accuse them of having a defective mind.
Yeah.
And so their mind is unhealthy or unhygienic, either because they're mentally ill, usually referred to by their enemies as being crazy, which Trump loves to say about his enemies. They're evil, meaning there's something wrong with their character, fundamentally,
right.
Or they're stupid. And those three accusations, you're stupid, crazy, or evil, those underlie almost every culture war attack that you see now. Like if you strip it down, what it ends up being about is the enemy is too dumb to make decisions for themselves. The enemy is too evil to be allowed to have any agency, or the enemy is crazy, so we can't take them seriously.
Yeah.
And those are the psychological weapons that we have at our disposal. And they are so effective because once you've accused someone of being one of those things, they can't defend themselves because they can't be trusted.
Right. Yeah.
It's dark.
It's dark, but it also is one of those things where it's like that becomes the totality of who you are. So any nuance of individuals is just completely erased because you are just one, if not all three of those things, I think. I think that does that.
And it's important to remember also that all of those things are fake.
Yeah.
Like there's no such thing as being quote unquote crazy. You can maybe suffer from mental illness, but that's not what they're talking about.
No, certainly not.
You can't be evil. That's not a thing we can measure.
Yeah, right.
Like you can commit crimes, but that's different.
Yes.
And the idea of being quote unquote stupid, like literally every test we have to measure that has been found to be completely flawed.
Yeah.
Like IQ tests are just incredibly racist. All they really measure is how white you are. So anytime you hear accusations of stupidity, again, it's just a way of undermining that person's integrity or questioning their right to speak for themselves.
Yeah. And we hear that with Trump calls everyone low IQ. She's low IQ. And it's
correct.
Like that feels like a dog whistle on one hand, if I wanted to give him the credit of even having that historical knowledge. But like, it's also just, it is just this easy way to completely dismiss something, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's why, for example, the New York Times might not want to ever interview trans people in articles about trans politics because there's so much stigma, this idea that trans people are crazy, that they shouldn't be allowed to speak for themselves. You have to have some expert come in and speak for them. Like maybe their parents should speak for them.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's a way of erasing an entire group by saying, well, there's something wrong with their brain.
Right.
We can't talk to them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that really bright note, let's get actually bright here for a second and just talk about some of the ways that you have found to be at least potentially successful in kind of, I don't know what exactly I want to say, but, I think you use, or someone uses the term in a quote, collective therapy in order to recover from a psy war. Can you just take that where you will?
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me as I was writing this book is that we have a lot of rules around how to end a kinetic war. Mm-hmm. We have international laws around it. We have procedures. You take back all the guns. You disband the militias. There's all these steps you take. We don't have anything like that for psychological war. We don't have anything like that for culture war. So when you're in a culture war, there's no plan for how you win or how you disarm. And so I think that's something that we need to work on. And what does it look like to disarm from a culture war? What does it look like to end a culture war? Like what does that space look like when the culture war is over? And so one possibility, as I said, sort of jokingly, but not really in the book, is that it's a form of collective therapy. Like the nation has to go through a period of processing all of the trauma, because let's be real, the point of culture war is to traumatize the enemy. Yeah. And it works. We are all feeling really traumatized. And it's something that we will have to recover from probably for the rest of our lives. So I think part of the goal with Stories Are Weapons, my book, is to propose different ways that we can undo the harm of culture war and we can call a truce. And there's really kind of 3 parts to that. There's, telling better stories. In other words, replacing these traumatizing stories that circulate in culture war and replace them with stories that are more restorative and that are about repair and about democratic decision making. Another part of recovery from culture war is restoring history. And I talk a lot about keeping receipts and like while the war is happening and to keep records of what's actually gone on. And one of the things that we see now, to return to the Indian Wars briefly, is that a lot of indigenous nations and tribes are in fact restoring their tribal histories and are gaining access to documents, often from like the War Department in the 19th century, that tell the story of how their land was taken from them and where their ancestors lived and what their languages were. Like a lot of the time, especially on the West Coast during the Indian Wars, this is so horrible, but the War Department would send war anthropologists out to gather information about the culture and languages of the tribes that they were genociding. So you have these incredible cultural records, mostly written by white settlers, about nations that didn't have any access to that stuff until pretty recently. And so I write about the Coquel tribe in Oregon and how they gained, it's such a great story. I'm not going to go into it, but you have to read the book. But they gained access to all of these historical documents about their tribe and about where their ancestral lands were through these War Department documents. And I looked through them. I went to their archive and it was really moving and incredible. So there's telling better stories, there's keeping receipts and restoring history. And then the other thing that I think we have to consider if we want to end this culture war is changing the structure of our media. Right now, we're in a phase with social media where information spreads virally in a way that's completely unregulated. And that's a recipe for moral panic. It's a recipe for propaganda and fake news and misinformation. There's no oversight of abuse. I mean, you look at a platform like X, all of that stuff is actively harming people and cannot continue to exist in that form under cultural peace. Like if we're going to declare cultural peace, we have to come up with ways to regulate our media so that it is not actively harming groups of people. So that's not easy. I'm not saying like, we just, it's a simple document, but these are the things that we need to think about. And so what I often recommend with social media is just this one simple phrase, which is slow it down. And slowing it down means making virality much harder, like making our interactions on social media have more friction in them, which is much more like real life. Like in real life, you can't just spread a story to like 1 million people in a second. You have to like talk to different people and have conversations. And like there's friction that prevents these kinds of like wild stories from spreading everywhere. But the other thing about slowing down is creating the friction of regulating what's said in the public sphere, preventing hate speech from flooding the public sphere. Those are all really important pieces of declaring cultural peace. And I think for me as a writer, the thing that has been most important that I've gotten out of that is to tell different stories, because that's something that I can do and can control. After I publish Stories Are Weapons, I divide my time between writing science fiction and writing nonfiction. And so I wrote a science fiction novella called Automatic Noodle. which is about recovering from war. And it's about one of the characters was working in PSYOPs. And so there's a PSYOP campaign that happens in the book, and they defeat it. And that book has actually done very well. It was a bestseller. And I was like, okay.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was very happy. And I felt like that, in a very tiny way, was one way of like putting a story out into the public sphere about unwinding from war and about what that looks like and what that feels like. And I think that's super important, that people have stories about ending wars instead of fighting wars. And, you know, there's many great books about how to fight information wars. Peter Pomerantsev has this incredible book called How to Win an Information War, which I highly recommend. It's full of great advice on how to win the war. But when it's over, how do we recover?
Yeah.
Like, how do we rebuild our communities? How do we like learn to love and trust each other again? So that's what Automatic Noodle is about. And I put like all of my warm and cozy feelings in there. And I think, you know, that can be very powerful for people. A lot of people have said to me, you know, that they read the book in the last couple months, and it's been, you know, obviously things have been really horrific politically in this country, and that it did give them a sense of hope. And so really, I think, I don't know, that for me has been like one tiny little moment of feeling like we can make it through this, and we do have the tools at our disposal. And like one of those tools really is telling better stories.
Yeah.
But also keeping history and, you know, maintaining our giant boxes full of receipts, and also reimagining media.
Yeah.
Like, oh man, when this culture war is over, the media landscape is going to be so different. It's going to be just unrecognizable. And I cannot wait for that. I mean, I hope I can't wait for it to be more progressive.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what all of this reminds me of too, that was so well put, by the way. I feel like the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about, especially after kind of going back through your book and reading about the ghost dances again, what was so powerful to me about that, among many other things, was that the dance and the protest was about a better future. So it wasn't just like, because, you know, I think we rightfully are in this massive, you know, I think we can call it a culture war. We can call it a war, maybe at this point, and like a almost a civil war, right?
It's both. Yeah. They almost always go together.
Right, exactly. But it's like we are fighting against something that we have to be mobilizing and fighting against. But I also really want us to figure out a way to like continue to also keep in mind like what we're fighting for and what that future can actually look like. And in terms of the ghost dance, it was like, what does it look like when our oppressors are no longer here or no longer in power? And so I think imagining what could be is also such a powerful thing for us to do. And I think a moralizing thing for us to do as well, in just like a sea of demoralizing content that we're seeing and experiencing every day.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is a huge part of why the ghost dance is such an important political movement. I mean, aside from the fact that it really is the first mass protest movement in the United States. And I feel like, you know, this idea of a better world, which now we call indigenous futurism, is really becoming much more mainstream. You have authors like Julian Noiscat, who has a fantastic new book out called We Survived the Night, which is basically about that. It's about how do you survive trauma? How do you continue to like look forward to the future when you're dealing with so much history, when you've got so much baggage? And I think that's why I love science fiction. Progressive stories help us imagine a future that is governed by democratic norms and by compromise and by people working together to solve problems. And oftentimes, you know, fascist or authoritarian messaging or propaganda is focused on foreclosing the future because the present is all we have. and the future will be just like the present.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is about how do you just continue the present into the future?
Yeah, it's either the present will continue or the past will return, I suppose, when it comes to authoritarians.
Yeah.
Well, how about we say, here's to telling better stories. Here's to telling stories about a better future. And I want to thank you so much for coming on and giving us your amazing knowledge base and for all the work you've done. So thank you, Annalee. I hope you can come back again sometime soon. This was American Hysteria. Make sure you pick up a copy of Annalee's books, Stories Are Weapons, and Automatic Noodle, and check out Flaming Hydra as well. One more thing I wanted to share. The despair is fucking real, and the only true antidote I've found has been getting involved in local mutual aid groups and groups organizing against ICE, as well as getting out into the streets and joining general strikes when possible. All we have right now is each other, and dear listeners, I could not imagine a better group of people to fight beside, so thank you. If you want to support our show and get ad-free episodes and bonus content, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. If you go to AmericanHysteria.com, you can pick up some of our merch. 100% of those profits go to the Samir Project, a Palestinian-led mutual aid group who are on the ground in Gaza delivering food and supplies. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius-Smith. This episode has editing by Kaylee Jasperson, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope somehow you have an empowering